Please. I'm Dr. Bob Coleman from Animal and Food Science and State Extension Specialist. It is really exciting to see this many people in the room. I almost forgot what it looked like to stand up at the front and see so many people. So it's really exciting and glad everybody is here. We have a few housekeeping things. I know we have coffee and water in the back, and there are, for those of you that need to have your fruits and vegetables every day, we have fruits and vegetables for everybody. You are welcome, because I know some of you probably would not make that selection if it wasn't quite so available. And no, I'm not speaking, yes, I am speaking from personal experience. We'd like to thank our sponsors, Central Equipment, Derby State Equipment Sales, Farm Credit Mid-America, Hallway Feeds are here, McCauley Brothers are here, Robert Davis and Sons Hay and Straw, and Tribute Equine Nutrition. Those sponsors really make things like this doable, and we greatly appreciate their support. And those sponsors have been with us for a long time, helping to put on educational programs for horse owners here in this part of the state. And certainly Pastures Please has been a program that's been around quite a while now, and it is because of county agents in this part of the state that have started this. It was 3 county agents from Jessamine County, Woodford County, and Fayette County many years ago, because I think it might have been after the 2007 drought. And all of a sudden everybody was saying, last year was really bad. What's this next year? What's 2008 going to look like? What am I going to have to do for my pastures? Do I have to do anything special? And the agent said, well, let's talk about it, and got together, started Pastures Please, and it's been going ever since. And the agents do a wonderful job of helping put it on, the logistics of this, but they also are the ones that are saying, this is what we're hearing from our clientele. This is what we're seeing in pastures across the area, and this is what is important and people need to hear. So that's kind of where the topics come from, and certainly our county agents just do an absolutely outstanding job. And I know for those of us that are specialists, if it wasn't for county agents, there would be almost an impossibility to do the job that all of us get to do. So thank you to them. I would try really hard to name everybody, but we know that with my advanced years, I will probably forget people. So just thank you. And maybe what we should do is have all the county agents stand up so everybody can see who you are. And if I could ask everybody here to thank them for their efforts in tonight. We have a great crowd in the room. We also have some that are here thanks to the wonders of Zoom and technology. Like you, I'm much happier to be here in the room with you. I've already had 2 Zoom meetings today, and I'm pretty much zoomed out for today. That happens most days. So, is Dr. Smith ready? So, some things to talk about and to get started with. We'll start. Yep, we're a little early. I guess we don't have to start just yet. Are you ready to start?
I'm ready.
We might as well start. There's no sin in being early, according to my father. So pasture health, and how do we identify pasture health? Because we have it. I think a lot of times people think that, well, the grass is out there. If it rains, it'll grow, and now I have pasture, right? And as long as it's green, it's good. And one of our colleagues, Tom Kane, used to tell my students when he worked for Creaches, and I would take them there, and he said, well, here's the deal with, hey guys, if it's green, it's good, let's go on. It's like, well, what if it's not green? Well, then it's brown and it's bad. So there's more to pasture than it just being green. So with that, Dr. Smith, if you want to lead us off talking about pasture health.
Great, glad to. You all hear me okay through this? Okay. We'll mainly save questions for the end, so jot them down if you have any questions as we go through. There will be door prizes. That's when you got little tickets when you got in. Those of you that will stay right to the very end, you'll get a chance for those door prizes. And Bob mentioned that this is on Zoom. It's not a live Zoom session. We're recording it. So if you want to go back and listen to it, or you find somebody that you think would benefit from this, then what we'll do, Krista, I think, is send out to the email. We've got your email if you registered online. If you didn't, make sure your email is out at the registration, and we'll let you know that Zoom link, and also upcoming events. Like, we don't have our field day planned yet, but we'll likely have a field day on a farm like we did Spendthrift last fall, this probably late May, June, like we've had it traditionally. So everyone has on the table a handout, and I'm going to go through that. If you'd like to follow along, feel free, but you don't need to. I'll show you slides. And this is something that Reilly, our grad student in the back there at the UK booth, has been working on finalizing this. All of the people listed here have worked on it. And I don't know whether you'll use this as an actual scorecard and score your farm. I'll tell you how to do that. But it does give you some very good points about what to look for in your pastures. And I'll kind of take you through that as I go through. So here's your first quiz question. You know, educators, we got to give quizzes and tests. Is this a healthy pasture? Well, now it's got really good cover, not much bare ground, and it looks nice to the suburbanites driving by, but it's mainly buttercup. Bill's going to talk about controlling buttercup. The other thing, though, when you see something like this, whether it's buttercup or other things, but buttercup's a really good indicator that there was a lot of bare soil the previous fall and going into the winter. If you had really good grass cover, you wouldn't have so much buttercup. So we know this is not healthy, not just because we see buttercup, because of what we know the symptoms were that led up to it. I'm throwing this at the very beginning, kind of so I don't forget. If you say, I want to get a lot more information, this is interesting that what you've gone over. So I encourage you to, if you Google KY Forages, you'll get to our forage website. Right here in the middle is a tab on equine, and we've got all of our main pasture management publications related to equine. If you want to get some more detail on things that Bill's talked about, if you go there under weed, insect, and diseases, you'll get to the pub that we have back at the booth that has color photos and several other ones. I just threw up an example of one of the ones under that equine tab. Okay. This is the whole pasture health scorecard. Bo, what's the camera showing? Is it recording me as well? Okay. Okay, sounds good. Okay, so the back page of your handout actually shows the scorecard. But I've blown up an example here of what you're seeing. So, for example, you want to kind of get an idea, how much bare soil do I have? I don't have the number at the top, but this would be 5 over here. You have very little bare soil, you get a very good score. For broadleaf weeds, if you have less than 2%, you'd get a really good score. That'd be 5, and it on down to 1. I'll explain a little bit more with another example in a minute. But in essence, you're trying to give a score for how good the pasture is on these different criteria, 1 to 5, 5 being the best, 1 being the worst. And then at the end, you kind of add up and say, what shape is my pasture in? Nobody's going to get 100. Krista, we probably never got more than the low 90s. But that gives you an idea of, am I on the right track, or do I not need to start doing a lot more management? And I'll take you through each of these. So the first one is desirable grass cover. That just means how much of the ground is covered, but not just covered with anything, because you saw earlier that one pasture was covered with buttercup. How much of the ground is covered with grasses that you actually want? Things like orchard grass, Kentucky bluegrass. Even tall fescue is desirable if it's not a broodmare pasture. So what are grasses that you want to have? How much of the ground is covered? Not only does that make a pasture look good, but that gives you an indication. If there's a lot of bare ground, then you probably need to think about some overseeding. So here's how the scorecard would work. If you have 70 to 100% of the ground is covered with desirable grasses, you'd have a 5. If you get down here into the middle, slightly more than half has desirable grasses. 30 to 50%, that would be a 3. And very little desirable grasses, like you saw in that buttercup picture, you'd have a 1. So again, that just gives you a feel that's going to help with your management decisions later on. Now, the second thing we have on the scorecard to help with determining if you have healthy pastures is desirable grass diversity. Now, in central Kentucky, many people would say, my goal is to have a Kentucky bluegrass pasture. 100% Kentucky bluegrass is what I'd like to have. I'm shooting to have that if I can. But in fact, I don't think, Krista, we've ever seen a pasture that was 100% bluegrass. In fact, we've seen very few that were more than 60 or 70%. So really a healthy pasture has a mixture of grasses. If you had 100% Kentucky bluegrass and we got into a hot, dry period in the middle of the summer, you'd just have a brown pasture. So having other grasses there makes sense. So that desirable grass diversity is those grasses that you want to have. Do you have 2 or 3 of those in the pasture, or maybe even more? Better to have a few different ones. They're going to adapt better to drought, to cold, to different environmental conditions. We've got a copy of a forage identification and use guide in the back that you can look for those desirable grasses. Many people ask me, and Bill probably ask you about identifying weeds. How can I identify plants better? There's a number of online apps now that do quite a good job. One that's free, put out through National Geographic, is called iNaturalist. You can just type that in, download the app. You take a picture, press a button, and it gives you the top few choices that plant or weed or grass or tree or even a bug is. One that we found in our pasture evaluation program that's a little more effective is called Picture This. There is a small fee to that, but it's quite small. So Picture This, we found to be a little bit more accurate. The iNaturalist works quite good, though. Okay, often when I'm talking to equine groups, I don't talk a lot about clovers. Typically, when I'm talking to cattlemen, I talk about all the benefits of adding clovers to your pasture, the added gain, the dilution of tall fescue, etc. Those are still valid points, whatever livestock species we have. But many of you don't want a really high percentage of clover, and for good reason. But a low percentage clover, 20 to 30%, you're getting a lot of benefits and very little disadvantages with having that kind of percentage of clover. White clover, for example, it fixes 50 to 150 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year. What we mean is our air that we're breathing is about 78% nitrogen. But plants can't take that up. But in clovers, in alfalfa, in other legumes, the nodules on the root system have rhizobia bacteria that can take that atmospheric nitrogen and put it into a fertilizer form. So at current fertilizer prices, 30% white clover in a pasture would provide you about $50 per acre of free nitrogen every year. Now, in much of this region, you're going to get some white clover anyway. You don't have to plant it. I mean, you can add some seed. But when you're thinking about how do I manage pastures, if I only have a few weeds out there and you spray most of the herbicides Bill will mention, they're going to kill the clover. So it's good to be able to keep some clover in the pasture unless you've got issues that have real problem weeds or real high levels of weeds that you need to kill those out. So when on the clover estimations, we talk about 30% is a good amount. We don't want you to have none, and we don't want you to have 80%. So the 5 is what we feel like is a good amount. So though some people differ with that. And actually, whether you use this scorecard or just something yourself, Now you come up with what is ideal for me, and then if you keep track from year to year how your pastures are doing, that's going to help a lot in managing those pastures. Third thing we have here is bare soil, or fourth thing, bare soil and warm season annual grasses. So you may look at a pasture, in fact, many pastures that we would call they're not in such good shape, you might look at them in the summer and they're covered, the ground's covered. Maybe the horses are even eating the grass really well. But if it has a lot of warm season annual grasses like crabgrass or foxtail, then those are going to die after frost. It's going to be bare soil all winter long. Other weeds are going to grow like buttercup and other things. So we clump both of these in together. When we look at a field, if it's got 20% bare soil, but it's also got 20% annual grasses that we know are going to die after frost, then we would say it's 40% effective bare soil, you might say. Now, I'm not talking about a lot like this with bare soil. I'm talking about more of an area that you just got a fair bit out there. So foxtail here on your left, an individual crabgrass plant in the middle, and a crabgrass in more of a pasture situation. Now, Bill will talk about controlling foxtail. Some of the things he'll mention would control crabgrass. Crabgrass is kind of a love-hate relationship because it actually is one of the most nutritious grasses that we have. So horses can do very well on it, but it is an annual, so it is going to die out. But many of us have crabgrass in pastures. The problem is if you start to have 20 or 30 or 40%, then that means you've got a lot of bare soil. But having some of that mixed in is not a problem, whereas foxtail is a problem. So if you, in our pasture evaluation program, we say that if it's more than 25% bare soil or annual grasses, you definitely need to do some overseeding. Even when it's 10 to 15%, some overseeding can be helpful. So we've got this Establishing Horse Pasture publication. You can see on the website, you can pick up one in the back there. So if it's just a bit of bare soil or annual grasses, then overseeding. Going through there with the seed drill in the fall of the year. Early mid-September is a good time. Using high quality seed. September is the right time in Kentucky. A no-till drill where you've got the depth set very shallow. You'll see all of this in that Establishing a Horse Pasture publication. And then the last comment is probably the most important, is rest. Anytime you put new seedlings, they really are slow to get started. You want to give the pasture a rest. And that rest you may say, I can only afford a month. Well, a month is better than nothing. But with overseeding, to have several months is going to increase the chances of those new seedlings start. Even with a fall seedling, if you could wait till the following spring, would it be even better? You might not be able to do that, but any rest is going to be helpful. Here's an example of a quite good overseeding establishment with orchard grass and rows going into an existing pasture. Often with overseeding, though, because of the competition with what's there, you don't get this good of success. So not only is rest important, but before you overseed, it's important to have that pasture grazed down closely or even mowed so that there's not as much shading from the existing grasses and plants. We found over time, though, if your pasture health, this scorecard or just your eyeballs, you say this pasture's in bad shape. It's got a lot of weeds, it's got a lot of other issues, then one of the most effective ways to have a perfect pasture, about the only effective way, is to start from scratch. That means killing out what's there. That means, again, fall is a better time to plant than spring. You put in the species that you want with a complete or total kill. That would be using a glyphosate product, a couple of applications, mid-July into August, and then planting. You can get a very good establishment. Now, that top line there, you may kind of balk at and say, there's no way that I can rest a pasture 12 to 18 months. What I'm saying there is that for a new stand to get completely established and have a good sod that's really going to handle foot traffic or hoof traffic, it's going to take 12 to 18 months. So if you establish in the fall, if you can wait till that following spring or even early summer before you're really doing much grazing, and then that first year, just be careful with your grazing. Don't turn a large number out. Don't leave them out there all summer long. Because when you're establishing a new pasture, your goal is to have something that's going to be there for 5 or 10 years or more. But if you try to get animals on it right away, then it's going to have a hard time establishing. Another thing on our pasture scorecard that most anybody knows to look for, what kind of weed pressure do I have? In this case, the weeds are mainly broadleaf plantain. It's not a toxic weed. Some horses will graze those, some don't. It actually is quite nutritious, but it's a really low-growing plant. So it's taken all the room in this pasture that plantain is taking up is where you'd really like to have good grass growing. Also, if you've got that much plantain, it probably is a symptom of other issues, likely overgrazing, allowing that plantain to get a good start. So with weeds, you would give it a score on our score sheet of a 5 if you have less than 2% broadleaf weeds, which is actually quite rare unless you've been actively using herbicides. But minimal weeds, like a less than 10%, that's not too hard to achieve. You'd still get a pretty good score using this scorecard. And just adding to that, remember with how you're managing pastures, not to try to say, I want a pasture that I don't have any weeds or I don't have any bare soil. If you've got horses out there grazing and hoof traffic, etc., you're going to have some weeds, some bare soil. Just be able to tolerate some of those things there. It's just when you get down to where you've got significant weed pressure, you've got 25 to 50%, you need to think about doing something. Now, Bill, you'll probably comment on this, but we've got copies of this publication in the back. So really good publication. On the front side, it has the photos of the common weeds in pastures in Kentucky, the common broadleaf weeds. On the back, it gives those weeds and the products that control those. Bill will be highlighting a couple of the problem weeds and some of the control measures, but this is something that you can take home with you. Next thing on the scorecard is perennial weedy grasses. Anybody recognize what this grass is? Any guesses? Nimblewheel. If you, at first glance, if I didn't know any better, I might guess it was Bermuda grass because they're both similar. They both grow in the summer. They both spread. But we don't have a lot of Bermuda grass in horse pastures in central Kentucky unless they've spread in from a lawn where someone had, or sports field where they've planted Bermuda grass. But nimblewheel is a native grass to central Kentucky. In fact, the whole region in states surrounding us. So it's, when I say it's native, I mean it was here when Daniel Boone came. It's here when the Native Americans came. And normally in just nature, it's not a real issue. But it's a grass that horses do not eat. I've never seen, I don't think, more than just a nibble, Krista. Would you say that? In fact, does it help you if you have cattle or goats or sheep? I've not seen any animal that consumes nimblewheel. We don't know of any toxicity. For some reason, they just don't like it. So if you have it in a pasture, a little bit doesn't matter. But if you have very much, you got a lot of your pasture that is not available for consumption. Plus, the horses are eating around it. We had a farm a few years ago that it looked like, because the grazing pressure, that they were overstocked. But they weren't overstocked on a per acre basis. But in that pasture, they had 60 to 70% nimblewheel. So they really only had 30% of the ground area, 30 to 40% that had the ability to grow grasses. So nimblewheel is an issue. And Bill, I think from our conversation earlier, if you've got a lot of nimblewheel, Roundup is the only way to deal with it. Okay, couple of applications of Roundup, start your pasture over. That's really the only solution. If you just have a little bit of nimblewheel, that's just kind of normal, but important not to overgraze. Important to do some overseeding so you have good competition from cool season grasses. Johnson grass is another perennial weedy grasses. Usually not an issue in pastures. Horses and cattle and other livestock like it. They'll consume that. They'll keep it grazed out of a pasture. If you've got high quantities, or they're eating this over a long period of time, you can have some health issues. But little patches like this, Bob, I wouldn't worry about a little consumption of that. So that's another one that's not as big of a worry as Nimblewell unless there's a lot. Bill mentioned, probably fair to mention your recommendation, Bill, with some patches of Johnson grass. An effective control is just spot spraying. You could spot spray with Roundup, but you're going to leave a dead area. Something Bill mentioned to me earlier, that the herbicide Plateau, some of you have used to remove fescue, a 1 ounce per gallon rate mixed in with, what was the surfactant, Bill?
Methylated seed oils.
Methylated seed oil. 1% methylated seed oil with 1 ounce per gallon of Plateau in a spot spraying, in a backpack sprayer. That's not going to kill the grass, your good grasses, your cool season grasses. It may set them back a little bit. That would be a way to control Johnson grass in that pasture. Like I say, Roundup does well, but it kills the other grasses. So if you used Roundup, you'd really rather use some kind of wicking mechanism. Okay, the next thing on the pasture scorecard that we look for and encourage you to look for is how are you managing grazing? Now, the reason I've got horses, I have horses in this picture, but I've got cattle and sheep as well, because we spend a lot of time when we're talking at our grazing schools and grazing conferences about grazing management. But it's just as important with horses as it is with cattle to think about how you're grazing, how you're managing the animals on that pasture. And I'll give you an example here. So if you had 4 pastures and you had 4 horses, this would represent that you've got all the gates open and those 4 horses can get to all of those pastures at any point in time. So that's continuous grazing. Now, most of us don't do it that way. We don't have the fences, it's just all one big pasture. But if you can subdivide or move the horses, in this case, they're on 2 of these pastures, and then they would move to the other 2 after 2 or 3 weeks, you're going to be starting to rotationally graze. Now, the reason Krista put together this simple example is you don't have to have 10 different paddocks that you're moving animals every 3 days for rotational grazing, like we talk about to our cattle farmers. Any rest that you can give a pasture, even if it's just 2 or 3 weeks, is going to be a benefit for that grass. And I'll give you an example of that in this next slide. Okay, this is 2 orchard grass plants. The one on the left, we cut once a week down to 1 inch. And we did that for a month. The one on the right, we cut to 3.5 inches at the beginning of the month and at the end of the month. So representing what would happen if you were being able to rest that pasture and you gave it a rest period. 6 days later, this is the amount of regrowth. Okay, where we had been cutting it, our simulated grazing once a week, that plant had very little reserves. It didn't have much leaf area. It had very little carbohydrate reserves in the base of the stem. It's barely coming back. Where the one that had the rest period, once it cut it short and it had the rest, you see how much growth we've got in 6 days. And many of us, our real goal is to get orchard grass into pastures. If you're going to keep orchard grass in pastures, you're going to have to give some rest periods. And a limitation with that one on the left, if a horse goes back into there, they're going to go after that really young succulent plant material and graze it again. I mentioned earlier that tall fescue is not a problem in horse pastures except for the brood mares. But if you have orchard grass and fescue side by side, they're going to always go after the softer orchard grass. And so you're going to end up increasing your fescue. And it's going to get tall and tough, and they're not going to consume it. Okay, here's another important point with the value of resting. Just 3 plants here that were dug out of a pasture that had been clipped at different intervals. So this was over a period of about 3 months. This was cut to 2 inches every week, kind of like a horse would probably do if they had access to that pasture that entire time. This was cut to 2 inches every 2 weeks. This was cut to 2 inches every 4 weeks. Look at the difference in the roots. So the plant on the left that had that continuous or regular defoliation, it had pretty well lost all of its root system. If you moved into a drought period, that plant's it's going to shut down right away. The one there on the right that had the rest period, it's going to be excessing water and nutrients down a couple of feet deep. So it's going to handle the drought period. It's going to come back quicker after grazing because of those root reserves and reserves in the base of the plant. So just to, again, you may say, I can't rotationally graze because the nature of the way I have to group horses, but think about it. Can you do this? Can you try to not graze closer than 3 to 4 inches? Can you remove horses, again, periodically? If some things are grown up tall or there's a lot of weeds, then maybe you mow the pasture. Many of us do that. Mow to 4 to 5 inches to even out height if you want to, or if you need to. Allow that pasture 2 to 4 weeks of rest, or let it grow back to 8 to 10 inches. You know, in the spring of the year, you don't need to wait 4 weeks. The grass is growing back really quickly. Again, you might can mow if you need to from a weed standpoint, but if you're using this kind of rest rotation practice, a lot of the weeds are not going to be as much of an issue. And then return the horses to a pasture. So whether you're thinking about move animals based on number of weeks, whether you move them based on let it get up to 8 to 10 inches, either way works. The main thing is having some rest period. Another thing we look for in pastures is stage of growth. Now, if you're regularly mowing, it's probably not going to be an issue. You're not going to have a lot of seed heads. If you're not regularly mowing or you're trying to limit the mowing, then when grasses get up with seed heads, then the quality drops. They're not growing back as fast. So we would score a little bit lower a pasture that's got a lot of seed heads versus one that's in a leafy vegetative stage. A fortunate thing in central Kentucky is we're dealing with cool season perennial grasses, mainly in our pastures. So they're only producing seed once a year. So they're producing seed from kind of mid-May to the middle of June. And so 1 or maybe 2 mowings during that period are going to take care of your grass seed heads. So you don't need to mow every couple of weeks or every 3 weeks throughout the whole year. If you mow during that period and maybe again later in the summer for some weeds that come up, some broadleaf or annual weeds, then you can reduce the amount of mowing and still keep pastures at a good stage of growth. Okay, a real thing to emphasize that's not an easy thing to deal with is a loafing area. Horses congregate, whether it's around water, whether it's in that paddock that you don't have any place else to put them, and they overgraze it, they get it down to mud. What do you do about that? So a simple thing to say, it's a little more costly and a little more effort to do, is to think about a dry lot or think about a feed pad. We've got this publication in the back, and there's a couple of other ones on the website just with how to construct a dry lot or feed pad. In fact, we can go through some of the sequence of that. But in short, it's a bit of grading. It's putting down filter fabric, gravel, and then typically dense grade on top of that. You can put down concrete, but that's more expensive and often a little bit hard over time on those legs. So if you have that dry lot or feed pad, not only are there benefits for feeding on that, but there's for sure benefits in protecting your pasture. Let me just give you an example. If you think about over this particular winter, and you've got an area that, well, let's say your whole farm, the horses have had access all winter long. They've grazed it down to just almost nothing. And I'm going to show you the growth over a period of about 2 weeks. In this one, it's been grazed all winter. and this one that was not grazed over winter. So it went into the winter, the end of the fall, it had been grazed, but it was here 3 or 4 inches tall. So obviously, I'm encouraging you to think about resting in the winter. Not every pasture, you got to graze some, but having some pastures that are left ungrazed. We're looking at about 3 days here, about 6 days here, about 9 days here. Actually, the last one's 15 days. That's still the difference, even after a couple of weeks under ideal growing conditions in the greenhouse. It would take probably a month in the spring to get this in the field. Look at the difference in the growth that came back with that one that was rested versus the one that was grazed hard. And Bill, there's a lot more weeds in that one too that was grazed hard coming up. The last thing in our pasture health scorecard is looking at, is there a lot of thatch, a lot of dead grass in that pasture? I don't have a real good picture of color, but I've kind of yellowed this grass a little bit. Is the grass itself kind of a yellowish color rather than a bright green? That's going to show kind of a nitrogen starvation or nitrogen deficiency. Having a little bit of clover will help with that. Periodic nitrogen, particularly fall nitrogen, can help with that. So if you've got a lot of thatch, it means there's not good biological activity. It means that dead grass material that should be recycling into the soil is not being broken down. If you got that light green color, it means that the grass is being starved for nitrogen. So that's not a good thing. You can, again, you can cure that by a bit of clover, by a fall nitrogen application, maybe some compost out there. Last couple of slides is we've got a handout in the back and on the website that I really encourage you to get. If you say, I want to just, what's a simple way, what's a simple guidelines I can use for improving my pastures? This is just front and back. Goes over simple things. In fact, most of what I've talked about. It adds in soil sampling as well. And it even gives a little schematic there for doing that draw lot or feeding pad. And if you can just, even as simple as these couple of pages, you can follow that, you've got a really good chance to improve your pastures. Now, last thing I'll mention is we've got a publication called the Equine Science Review. In fact, if you Google just that name, it'll pop up. You can look at past issues. It'll give you this link that you can register to get that emailed monthly. We used to have this publication or the variation of it called the Bluegrass Equine Digest that the horse publication put out. That arrangement is no longer available, and so we give it to you directly on your email, but you'll have to sign up for it. So encourage you to do that. That we contribute often. Krista, raise your hand. I've mentioned Krista's name a lot. She manages our pasture evaluation program, so a lot of credit to her for things that we're doing. She writes often in this, but people in the Gluck Center, people in ag economics are writing articles regularly about work that's happened at University of Kentucky in the equine area.